Now, surprisingly, you have kept time. So there's a lot of time for discussion. But let me kick off one round of discussion here, and then I'd like to invite all of you to join in. Um, Dave, you that in a nutshell, the question is, what's different? I mean, what's happening that's different? I mean, Dave, you mentioned that as the underwater cable as is one of critical element that changed the nature of the world. And Jun probably pointed out that Fukuzawa was one of the first person to recognize that. But at the same time, the cable has been around for 150 years. Are we simply talking about just an extension of what's been happening, or I think we are beginning to feel that the nature of the society, the market, the economy, market, society, the legal system that have worked good things and bad things for the last 150 years is probably changing in a fundamental way. And what is that critical thing that's changing the nature of the society and human being, or even the self, the way human beings are. Right? So what is the critical driver? And of course, the consequences we need to study. But then, what are the signs of change? I mean, what do you think is the critically important things that we need to look at?
Okay. Many years ago, I'm not sure the exact date, but it must have been 1980s. Paul Barron, who was the person who first proposed by-knowledge packet switching, and I published an article in Science, which is a sort of weird magazine in the U.S. That half of it is policy and half of it's biology. And I don't think either populations don't read both. But we published an article on the convergence of computing and communications. And I think that's the difference. It's not just that we have increased communications, it's that we have a new tool in there called computers. And the fact that the computers can interact with each other is the major change. Essentially, what we've created, like it or not, is a worldwide distributed computer system where the components of the computer are hooked together by our advanced communication system. But without the computers, it wouldn't do much. You know, we type to each other at gigabit speeds, but that doesn't sound very useful. It's the fact that we merged those two together in interesting ways that's caused revolution. And the fact that the computers have infiltrated everything we do. From my coffee pot at home, which is unfortunately hooked over my Wi-Fi system. I think I want my money back on that, by the way. To in fact, my cell phone, if it was working, which it stopped working, has really changed things. And as the Internet of Things, which I think is a misnomer, it's more and more computing hooked in to a global computer. And that's what we've essentially had, barring firewalls that countries may put in. But that is a fundamental change in everything we do.
Can I not release you just yet? So am I correct in understanding what you said is that there's somehow difference between person-to-person communicating over the wire versus machine-to-machine or machine-enhanced human and machine-enhanced human or machine and purely machine-to-machine communicating? What's that fundamental difference?
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental difference in that what we're really talking about at some point in the game is person-to-person communication enhanced by computing,
Right.
enhanced by the abilities to do things that before human beings have found very difficult to. Now, I can talk to somebody and instantaneously pull up information that helps in my discussion. On the other hand, I can do it in reverse. I can have computers talking to each other with humans as mediators, slightly different. And there are just a whole set of possibilities, most of which we haven't explored yet. And we've talked about it, but we haven't really tried. One of my favorite things is a project that was proposed, 30 years ago, by Alan Kay called Dynabook, for those who remember that. The interesting thing about Dynabook wasn't quite that it just projected portable computers. But more interestingly, on that was an intelligent assistant who did things for me, who acted in my stead, who amplified me. We still haven't gotten that. I think we're almost at the verge of being able to do it. But that, again, revolutionizes things, especially if we do as we've talked, which is to create a synthetic me by looking at, you use deep learning and all that stuff and create a model of what I would do in that situation so that I can ask my intelligent assistant, I can ask my alter ego, will you make me a reservation on I need to get to San Francisco, and that it would do what I would do if I had the time and energy to do it. That changes dramatically, and that's just not communication, and it's not just computing. It's bringing the two together in interesting ways.
Yeah, please, you may.
Yeah. In addition to those interesting technological change, and I think when we are utilizing the word civilization, and when we think about the kind of previous civilization things, then it's a kind of technology is supporting the people and society, but then mostly nobody is out, from the civilization. Right? When we call the civilization, then it's everybody is going to be in. So, Terry, can you show 17 now? Okay, this is this is when we worked on year 2000 was a very interesting year, and then the population of the internet is just 6% of the entire population in the world, and then so mostly North America and Japan and Europe. So then we worked together. So this is basically the kind of representing the process of how the internet was developed and created. But last year, then we finally, from 6% to more than 50% of the population now are utilizing the internet, and then so after all the community of the internet developers, and then we started to focus on just non-connected area only to be connected. So it's going to be very soon. Who's speaking?
Sorry.
And then so we are reaching to the almost Japan is like 84%, but then it's very soon that everybody is going to be on this cyberspace, right? Are you opposing me?
Is the communication conversation?
Yeah. Who is this?
I just turned it off.
Anyway, so that's so the important thing is everybody, right? Now, because everybody utilizing this technology, then we have to work. We have to think about, that's thing. And then, the things, I mean, machine to machine, actually speaking each other, but then the machine is a machine. So everything is going to be connected, and everyone's going to be connected, right? And everywhere is going to be connected. I can show you that, a lot of evidence that not only the submarine cable, but also all the new satellite and the low Earth orbit, based internet infrastructure is going to cover the entire space, like Danit's picture, right? It's a reality now. So that's one of the things that this and this is a big change, right? Everybody and then 6% are big change.
Then you probably want to say internet is not all.
I mean, it's more than just the internet is not the only way, the only thing. I think that a very critical point to note about the almost sudden explosion of internet use is that it's not powered solely by cable access. It's powered by broadband. And most of the users of the internet in developing nations, such as Africa, such as Latin America, a lot of Asia as well, are using broadband and not internet. And that means that they have access to a very specific subset of services within the internet. We have a realm of websites, and for example, June is fighting to make sure that websites are not banned. So that kind of freedom is provided to us as people who are using the internet in Japan because of June's struggle. But to a lot of other people around the world who have access to the internet, they don't get that luxury. And that's one thing I wanted to mention. In terms of the change, the transformation, I think that I would like to go back to the word amplifier, in the sense that we now have a technology that is indeed connected, that is indeed the combination of communication and computation. But what it does is it takes humans and it amplifies them, for better or for worse. We now have the capability to solve unsolvable questions about global warming and deliver consistent medical care. But we also have the ability to make really stupid mistakes that get amplified. Let me give you an example. Australia decided to automate debt collection. So they created an algorithm, an AI smart algorithm, but the problem is the calculation that the developers gave the algorithm was wrong. And because of that, it worked on a wrong calculation and basically got to the point that it detected $4 million of false debt. It just started inventing debt and demanding it from people in the country that would get a letter saying, you owe the government $10,000. And people had no idea why. And then they had to go to the government and fight with them over a debt that they never had. It's a stupid example, right? It's just the calculation that got wrong. But this really shows the potential of our ability to take everything that is good about humanity, the benevolence, the care, the empathy, and really amplify that to create very positive change. But it also shows how easily the foolish mistakes that we make, the bad things about humanity, can get just as amplified and really cause a lot of damage. So I think that we are reaching to a point that because of the connection between computation and communication, because of the ability to network all of these things, we're reaching a critical point where we really need to figure out what it is we want to get out of the technology and how we design to make sure that this is what we get.
You want to say something?
Yeah. No, I agree with what you're saying in part. I mean, we've done a spectacular job of making mistakes. If you ever dealt with a U.S. bank, even before AI or deep learning, we could do it. They could do an excellent job of following up stuff, human doing it. I think the thing that's tricky here, and I agree with you completely, we have a set of things that could go wrong that would be spectacularly bad. And, but I'm not sure, I don't think we can bound it. That's the problem. I think we have to understand it. There are many people who say, look, all we'll do is we'll put a firewall here, right? And that will stop some stuff. But it hardly ever does. In fact, it probably will never do it. Now, there's a story, I'm not sure I have the time to, I'll give you the short version of this, okay? How human beings can do things wrong very easily in spite of that. There was a question of what happens if a certain form of cyber attack happened in the US. I'll call it country X attacked critical infrastructure in the US. And the scenario that was suggested by a very competent organization, I won't mention the person, one of the major policy places in the US was, obviously, what we'll do is we'll remove that country from the domain name system. Good trick if you can do it. If that doesn't work, we'll disconnect them from the internet, whatever that means. If that doesn't work, we'll use a kinetic response. You know what kinetic response is? Okay. At very least, you throw bombs. Maybe you throw something bigger. I mean, it's that type of scenario that really worries me very much, because we don't understand how humans interact. And yeah, I agree with you.
I agree with you. I mean, for example, going back to the Australian false debt problem, is that the government never admitted that there was a problem. You know why? Because they said we used AI. Of course it's correct.
Yeah.
Clearly, there was a smart algorithm, therefore it is smart, and it made the smart choice. And I think that kind of touches upon the problem, is that people won't even recognize that the technology is not smart, that the technology is often fundamentally very simple.
Yeah, that's probably the a very interesting issue of the civilization. When we call it a civilization, then as I mentioned, then everybody's going to be impacted at least, right? And then, but those stories about the mistakes, failure, is always kind of the less understanding about what's going on, right? What is AI, and then what is the algorithm for AI, and what is the network, and what is the impact of the global space versus local country space. The very well. I'm not saying very few people, but then, there are many people who should understand about that kind of technological environment, but and they don't, right? There are many other people. So this is very much an issue of those two examples, and probably it should be a scope of the research center as well.
It was actually.
Well, yeah. This is very convenient, research center. So we find out the issue and then throw it to Daniel.
Good for the graduate students, by the way. There was an interesting article published today that I sent out to my mailing list on the senior scientist at the Allen Institute for AI, who is seriously worried about the evolution of deep learning systems. Fundamentally, he questioned whether or not they weren't prone to fail. And for a whole host of reasons. I mean, there's one that you can't understand what it's doing after a certain point. And the other is that we tend to take beta software, I assume everybody knows what beta software is, and send it out as if it's product. And in fact, some companies send alpha software out. They haven't even tested it. And we're seeing a lot of that, especially in the US, where the path sending out a new product probably increases the price of your stock, which increases your stock option value. So there's a built-in push to basically turn out stuff that should be questioned very seriously. The technology is hard enough when you interpose that with a complete lack of, I'll call it lack of ethics. You're in deep trouble, potentially.
I think I'd like to invite, there are a few faces that's bursting with things they want to say on the floor too. But let me first say that I am planning on another round of discussion on security and resilience and that kind of thing. So that's a very interesting topic to discuss. But for the time being, if you have comments on some of the critical, what is the critical driver that's driving change, and what are the consequences that we are beginning to see? What should we be looking at? And of course, Jim has something to say.
Just a quick comment, because I want to introduce a word in here. I mean, Dave talked about it a bit, that as we look at these civilizational changes, they're basically fundamentally premised on the modes of production, the economy. And so I think it's incredibly important, as people are putting together the research agenda, the things we're working on, that we really keep economy front and center, whether it's the digital economy or the broader kind of social economy that's developed up around the internet. And I think in that particular context, we have to realize that the internet was very, very interesting, but essentially it remained in the labs until companies and businesses begin to take it forward and embed it into society. And really the innovation and changes that are taking place now in this space fundamentally are being done by the private sector. And I think as we move forward with that, we want to be sure that we're constantly engaged with the companies, that we constantly understand that the innovation is coming from the economic opportunities that are opened up by these technologies, not the reverse. So digital economy should be front and center, and I think that we've talked over the last many years about what a digital agenda looks like, a digital economic agenda, and I think we need to keep those issues front and center. We need to be sure that economists, we need to be sure that business schools, we need to be sure that the law schools are all very much involved in the kind of projects that we're working on. So thank you.
Thanks for the comment. Let me throw a question at you then. Remember Dave has in his slide the core wealth. I think the notion of wealth is beginning to. It's not simply about money. I think what is going to be the core wealth in the cyber civilization?
Well, I think the core wealth is going to be the application of knowledge. We've talked about a knowledge-based economy, and clearly if you look at these companies like Google or Apple or even Microsoft, they've grown hugely powerful because of their ability to harness knowledge.
And some say it's the data. Whoever has access to a lot of data is like the holder of core wealth, or could it be credibility? Is it the one who has the highest social credit rating that's the most wealthy? Thank you.
How are they mutually exclusive?
It may not be.
Your ability to determine credibility would rely on your ability to substantiate that with knowledge. So in that sense, that data would lead to credibility, and if you have a digital fingerprint, therefore you exist. So maybe that's the idea. And kind of going back to your point, I think it is very true. And we need to be very much aware of that. However, we already have companies that are forging ahead with ample resources, the drive to innovate, and the ability to do so. I think that what we are lacking is that kind of idea of the digital agenda is bringing everyone to the table to have that kind of discussion. Companies are critical stakeholders, but so are society, and so are regulators. In that sense, I couldn't agree more. I would just put in that extra.
Yeah. Also, probably, basically I agree with Jim, but also, I agree with kind of set the digital economy as a front, but I'm a little bit, to worry about put that in the center though. So I don't know. Well, probably it's been the center of the evolution, but it's a very important, aspect of the civilization, but not the only one. So, as Danny said, it's a kind of a multiple important things should be sitting in the front. So.
As a former regulator, heaven forfend, I was chief technologist at the Federal Communication Commission, And actually, one of our advisors, Jerry Folhaber, was the chief economist. And I noticed two interesting things. If I propose something to the commission, I had maybe a 30% chance of it happening. And if the economist proposed something to them, maybe 30% chance. If both of us agreed and proposed it, it had close to a 95% chance of passing. So it's the fact that the economy and technology work together. The other problem I have, and this may be US-centric, is that companies lied to us. I mean, there's no other way of saying it. I sat in on meetings with the chairman and senior people from companies, including one of my students once. And afterwards I said, you lied to me? And he said, yeah, what the hell was I supposed to do? I couldn't tell you the truth. Now, companies working together, if we're to get that cooperation, they have to be truthful. And my experience in the US, and to a lesser degree in Europe, is that they don't necessarily tell you the truth, which makes it almost impossible as a regulator to do anything intelligent. I don't know, my suspicion is that it's not that bad in Japan, but I have, I'm new here, so.
Thank you for very, very stimulating discussion. My question will go to Dave first, perhaps, and perhaps to all the others. What are the real obstacles that would preventing the development of, say, for example, the international systems that you mentioned in the beginning, establishing understanding and so forth? Yes, it's all good, and we should really study that. But what are the real problems, headaches that we can't really solve that easily, that we need to tackle? That's my question.
Well, some of them are, we're still operating in the transitional civilization. We still have nation states. Nation states guard their powers. It's very hard to get international agreement. On the other hand, maybe it's not impossible. Again, you have a funny pressure because now we have, first time in a long time, international corporations. Now, Google is not a US corporation. So I remember doing one of the oil boycotts. Exxon proudly announced that when they were told not to, what to ship or not to ship, I forget which one it was, they said, we're not a US corporation, we're a worldwide corporation. So you have an opportunity there, although it has to be done very carefully, to get those two extremes together, but it's very, very difficult, especially for companies like Google, which sits at the edge of being something we haven't seen before, which is a monopoly, data monopoly, and that could happen. So there has to be some very careful negotiations, and I don't think they can take place without a broad spectrum of people. And it's not going to happen with standards bodies. It has to happen in a funny type of political structure, which we don't really have developed yet. But that's an interesting problem. Can you develop it? I think we have to, actually.
I think that one of the problems that we have, alongside the fact that we have companies that operate on such a large scale, and this goes back to a lot of the discussions that all of us had, is that we are entering what you might recognize as a tripolar world, where you basically have powers pulling and pushing in different directions, and they're using technology as their currency. So if you look, for example, at the growth of China, a lot of it has been stimulated by economic growth. A lot of that economic growth went into technological robustness. And we are kind of reaching a point where we have actors that have their own fundamental cultural values, different understanding, different incentives. And the way that they act with each other makes this kind of idea of having that governance system practically impossible. And it also does further, it does more than that. It actually makes the operation of multinational corporations and existing bodies that have already worked for us fail. because they're being gamified. So in that sense, it's not even just a technological program, it's not even a societal program. Well, it is a societal program because power and politics is the realm of the realm of humans. But I think that in that sense, we have an environment that is so competitive. How do we turn it into collaborative, even on the highest level, and then have it trickle down?
Well, I still think that in addition to that kind of the nation state governance things and on the cyberspace, but also the probably multiple segment of the stakeholders for this new society is going to be not only the business sector but also the government's legal regulators and the companies and the citizens, and those are stakeholders kind of working together. But it's I still worrying about the lack of understanding about what's going on and what's the impact of the technology, how the technology has been designed and driving, and that kind of thing is going to be getting very complicated, and then the impact is going to be growing very big, and then so the gap between the technology and the people's understanding is going to be a big problem. So how they can, everybody can understand what the impact of the technology.
Yeah, that raises an interesting thing considering where we are. Our education system has to take part in that. When I spent 15 years at the University of Pennsylvania, and I had a dual appointment in computer science and the Wharton School of Business. And remarkably, how little crosstalk there was. The business people who were going to be one way or the other leaders in business, at least they assumed they were, knew almost nothing about technology. And on the other side, the technologists do know almost nothing about business. And lawyers sat in the middle. Now, there's been an attempt to solve that a little bit, at least at Penn. One of our advisors, Jerry Fallhaber, is an economist, was an economist with a joint appointment of law. And in fact, he almost could do technology if he had to, which he doesn't want to. But it's part of the educational process that we've ignored to a large degree. We train lawyers. I'm not sure about KO. I haven't been here long enough. We train lawyers, we train economists, we train technologists. And I think we have to start turning out people who, yeah, they specialize in one thing, but they know the rest. I spent a fair amount of my time up on the Hill with Congress when I was chief technologist. And they were very intelligent people. The old vision of legislators not being very smart is just wrong. They are, on average, very bright people, but they don't know anything about technology, most of them, and yet they're constantly called upon to make laws that impact the technology, and that's a big problem. We don't have a mechanism for dealing with that in the U.S. And there's, in fact, now we're even in worse shape than we were, which was pretty bad.
I have this urge to have a law. We have a bunch of people from the law school and the legal. Can I have some law person? If nobody, Dave? Oh, okay, it is professor.
Yeah, I think that what Dave has said about the lawyers' training is definitely true today in Japan, where the above all else legal knowledge is emphasized, and there isn't a lot of time left for interdisciplinary training. I was just wanted to comment. I thought it was interesting. Jim's comment about how all of the innovation is being driven by business, I think dovetails with your comment about beta and sometimes alpha products being released. There's this whole business mythology about the nimble company and you just get it out on the market as quickly as possible and then you fix it later, which is the way that people have made some of the greatest fortunes of the last century and the greatest fortunes in the world today. And so that's not going to change without law, without regulation, without holding people responsible for missteps. And that's not going to happen on an international scale. It's going to be entirely at a national scale because we don't have the governance mechanisms to do any of this internationally. And they're really, in the current environment, aren't going to develop over the next decade, I think. So I tend to be a pessimist, I guess. Just more a comment.
I would like to push against that and share my experience. So I'm originally from Israel, which is known for many things, but among them, most people don't know that, but we have the highest number of lawyers per capita. We have so many lawyers and they actually don't have work. We also have the, I think, largest number of startups per capita, considering that we are a tiny country. And this is probably the best combination that I've seen, and that needs to build the top education, obviously, of the ability to bring together business and technology and innovation. So there's a lot of room to do that. There's a lot of room to do that even without regulation that is supportive of not. There is no regulation that makes it very easy to create a startup or help set it up. It's just a culture that developed and then investment came in, and now regulators are saying, oh, this is great, so let's just keep it going. So in that sense, I'm not sure I'm in full agreement with that, but then again, I don't think that's what you meant.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, unfortunately. Something we did in Philadelphia, which may help, may not, but monthly we have a meeting of cyber lawyers. It's a luncheon meeting. We get together people in the Philadelphia area, which has a lot of lawyers, believe me. And it's people interested in cyber issues, and there are usually technologists there who are interested in law. And we have a marvelous lunch, and both sides walk away having learned something. It's hard to get business people at that meeting, though, but at least it's 2 or 3 axes. That might be something worth considering, actually.
It's very interesting that the business and the new invention deployment of the new software and services. It's been a little bit of a different way in the happening, how it's going to be kind of getting bigger, successful in the United States versus the other part of the world, and especially in Japan. Do you think it's because of the lawyer system difference?
I don't know. I mean, my sense is that in the U.S., the lawyers haven't caught up with what's happening with startups in Silicon Valley, other than on the investor side, where there's a lot of focus on venture capital, investment rules, disclosure. But in terms of the product and in terms of the responsibility, I think startups are able to get away with a lot in the U.S. still. Although, as we see for a big company, it's the harshest compliance environment in the world when you have a problem.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting point that the relationship with the lawyer and then also the new technology deployment is different, depend on the environment, and then also probably this it's going to be a very interesting discussion that how we're gonna do it for the future.
Tokuda-san, would you like to make a comment, and then I'll have another comment.
So I'm Hide Tokuda from NICT. I'm used to be a colleague of Kokuryo Sensei and Murai Sensei, and old friend of Dave. Anyway, I have 2 questions. Actually, one is related to latest topic of AI. If you trying to use the deep learning, you need lots of data. And also the AI model may produce many output itself. So we have a big debate. Can we use many online data from the web space for deep learning. So one is a copyright-related law issue. The other aspect is fair or unfair learning, how we select the data sets for training the AI software. That's a little bit touchy issue. You mentioned about fake news, but training data itself is one of the challenging things. The second question is more like basic human rights for new cyber civilization. What would be the essential rights we should maintain or we should fight for? So that's your, yeah.
Well, I'll throw an AI and then over with you. I think we have to learn a lot about the handling of data. You know, for years there was this feeling that you could anonymize data. And Latanya Sweeney, when she was at CMU, a colleague of mine there, showed that that was bullshit, to use a term of the art. That in fact almost all the anonymous data you could identify. So that's a real serious problem. I think the second part is more interesting in a sense, and that's what do I own? What rights do I have to my data? Are my chromosomes for sale? Is my DNA for sale? Is my medical records for sale? What powers do I have as an individual versus the state versus the corporation? The problem we're in now is, I think very largely, that the individual is at the bottom end of this totem pole. Now, I've been on the board of trustees of EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, for 18 years, and that's usually the fight you're in. What rights do people have for their information? And there are different laws. The U.S. has a certain set of laws, but big corporations tend to ignore laws. Go sue us, it tends to be the thing. And believe me, they have more lawyers than most people have. So I think that's something that is going to be very difficult to iron out. And it may only iron out when companies are held liable. I hate to do that because I know I would hate to be in a software business when I was held liable for errors in my code. I'd probably get out of the business fast because we just don't know how to do that. That's another interesting issue, by the way. I've been in software engineering now since I began. We know just about the same amount now as we did 40 years ago. It's pretty sad.
Let me break down your questions. So in terms of data-intensive training, I understand the concern. I think that there is a serious gap where a lot of very powerful companies have access to a lot of data and are able to kind of continuously monetize it. We also have a problem with countries, for example, like China. Sorry, I lived in China before I moved here, so all of my examples. They have, over 1 billion netizens creating data like crazy, and all the data is harvested, is analyzed. I know that there are attempts to start developing algorithms that are initially trained on that are data intensive, but therefore afterwards don't need as much data. I had a discussion with Google about this in Bangkok last week, and I expressed my concern about having this kind of algorithm that doesn't require a lot of data, basically not being able to adapt and actually learn because it doesn't have access to a lot of data, and that's another problem. But we are at a problem where we're at a phase where data intensive is really the game changer. And in terms of privacy and fairness, there's so much work going on around that. The problem that we have is that a lot of the data that we publish on these platforms is considered public. If you want to use these platforms, you kind of relinquish your ability to save the data. A good example of that is basically Twitter. Everything that you post on Twitter is public, and everyone can use it. And you know that going into Twitter. But for example, if you talk about the Chinese WeChat, WeChat is an ecosystem that allows you to do everything. It allows you to message, it allows you to pay bills, it allows you to call a cab. You do everything through it. They sell there's a very clear announcement that says, we own your data. And if you don't like that, you shouldn't use WeChat. But if you don't use WeChat, you don't have access to half of the services in China. And considering that all the services are digital, you want to have access to them because otherwise you're left to fend for yourself against the system. Is that fair? Even if they know that it's public, is that fair? I don't know. So in that sense, there are a lot of questions that we should ask ourselves. What are the price that we pay for services? Because the one thing that I learned from not paying for product is that when you don't pay for the product, you are the product. And in that sense, we really need to think about that. In terms of human rights and digital rights, I've been working with Article 19 to understand how to really translate human freedoms into digital rights and our ability to act in the digital space. And this is something that we, as the people kind of thinking about the idea of cyber civilization, really need to consider. And I really appreciate you bringing this up. I think that this is going to be a topic that we could talk about for centuries. It would depend on the context. And that would also risk us creating another splinter net, so to speak, where different people have different rights. So for example, the rights to be forgotten and things like that we've already seen kind of really dividing the cyberspace, not global. So in that sense, I think that these are questions that we need to consider. And what are the kind of core proponents of human dignity, of respect, of liberty, that we really want to make sure we perpetuate in cyber civilization so that we don't degrade as a civilization.
Yeah, in many cities around the world, all your emotions are tracked. Your face is tracked, where you are. It used to be in New York, you could actually get an app that would tell you how to get from point A to point B without being surveilled. That's no longer available because it turns out there are almost no way that you can go. That is not something that's you voluntarily should have given them the right to do. And you're not getting anything in return, but in fact you're losing a fundamental right, the right to be left alone, right not to be surveilled, not to have your face recognition, there not to be a lot of not to be's. And I think that's the tricky part because, yeah, when I use Facebook, which I hardly ever use, I understand that I'm not paying anything, right? When I use Google Mail outside of university, I know that I know what they do with it. That's fine. When I use it inside a corporate shell, there are agreements, and I assume they honor those. But the problem is that line is not so clear. Every time I walk around New York City, I'm surveilled constantly. And I mean constantly. I'll give you a little example of that because it's amusing. In New York City, as many of our states, you pay, if you are a partial resident of New York, if you're there over half time, you pay taxes there. If you're under half time, you don't pay taxes, right? So what can the tax people do? Well, if they get into a debate and you're worth doing this with, they look at your cell phone records and see where your cell phone has been. They look at your use of the subway system because you had to charge that. They look at the use of your car because every traffic light in New York has a Easy Pass reader in it. And they claim not to use that, but in fact they can. I didn't volunteer for that. Okay? And if in fact I'm being an honest citizen, I shouldn't be surveilled like that. But those are the issues we have to face. Maybe we're just too far. Maybe that's one of the penalties we pay. But that's too close to 1984 for me. Everybody read 1984? Yeah,
Yes, I was involved in lots of international negotiations, including the one with Jim Foster in early 1990s. And then I achieved the OECD tax guidelines in 1996. And I was in the middle of the financial crisis in Japan, and I had to deal with lots of banking crisis. From that, I think, perspective, I would like to have three questions, probably mainly to David. Number one, is this the kind of issue which can be discussed and led by a certain leadership group, or is this an issue which needs a kind of a political public endorsement? That's number one. Number two, what magnitude of crisis is likely to trigger really serious discussion in certain groups or countries, or even in international, I think, society on this issue, which might lead to the actual regulation over this issue. That's number two. And my last question is this the issue which can be dealt with some kind of regulation? Or is this the issue which is beyond that kind of even international, I think, agreement? Those are my three questions. Thank you.
Yeah,
Huge ones.
yes, that's almost a day in and of itself. Let me try the first one first. I think it has to be a public discussion, but the public is not going to arrive at conclusions. I mean, in some sense, I think you have a mechanism which, if democracies or republics, none of us have a democracy, if republics work the way they purport to work, the public discusses, the legislators hear, and they act for the benefit of their constituents. I know of almost no place that happens in principle, but that's the way it should work. I think my tendency is to add one more thing there, which has been relatively successful when it's done right, and that's to have a really good set of experts look at an issue, write a report. If you're familiar with the U.S. National Research Council, which undertakes those studies for government, and is a reasonably balanced, in fact, very balanced. I've served on it for 18 years once, which is way past my half-life, by the way. And they issue a public report. And that public report now is quite often the basis for public discussion and legislative discussion. So you have an educated process, and if the initial group is balanced, which they try very hard to do, it works. What was the second one?
The magnitude of crisis.
Oh, I think we'll see that. I'll give you two crises. One is public, the finding out of information about particular people. I think if you get a couple politicians who find out things that they've tried to keep quiet, you will see action. And that's bound to happen. It's happened in the past, more accidentally, but now there's no reason it won't happen. And that's one crisis level. That will happen before 5 years from now would be my guess, if not before. But it has to be spectacular. We had a Supreme Court justice did make it that way, nominee. The other thing is, and this is slightly different, I think things that happen as a result of the lack of security and robustness in our cyber infrastructure could cause a crisis that will, if there's anything left afterwards, could cause people to face those issues. And I think that's bound to happen, personally. And that worries me a lot. That's something I like to spend a lot of time making sure my grandchildren don't see. Third one was? Regulation, I don't think you can control in and of itself. There are too many players in regulation, at least my experience. First, regulators tend to be influenced by, quite often, their political ambitions, quite often by industrial overload. it tends to be very difficult for them to go against the flow. And also, I think the only time a regulator can really be effective, from my experience, is where there's a public willingness to have it happen. And basically the regulators are given the job as opposed to the lawmakers. Regulators can operate a lot more effectively, but they need public support and industrial willingness to go that way. Anybody want to-
Regulation, talking about the regulation, that's a question, and then it's very difficult, as I mentioned, that, it's not only the, regulation domain is a nation state, and then it's certainly beyond the border of the, so it's not that easy. So it's happening already in many places.
As anticipated, we are short on time. Yeah. we need a long time to discuss this. Let me say, all of you are invited to reception at our faculty club after this, so we can continue discussion. But before that, before June becomes drunk, I think one another critical thing that Dave mentioned and then you mentioned is we want to discuss about security and resilience a little bit before closing our session here. And I think there were two aspects. We both about technological, so security and resilience of a technological system. That's one big area. And of course, we've been talking about security and risks and resilience of our society. And we probably don't have time to have discussion on both sides. But if I may invite Dave, comment on what are the critical threats we may be looking at, we should be looking at in terms of threats, and what are the sort of the core strategy? How should we even address in general about the security? So how can we be resilient is probably the question that I want to be asking here.
Oh boy.
Sorry to start this like 10 minutes before the close of the
conference. I may be stepping on sensitive turf, but I'll do it anyway. I think the biggest threat that we face now, and it's not just it's a threat that is aggravated by the cyber world, is nuclear threats. They're the ones that worry me the most. We no longer have scenarios, which we had for years, which policymakers could look at and understand that if they went down this track, the following thing was going to happen. That's gone. There's no strategic understanding there. We have a set of academics who firmly believe that the use of tactical nuclear devices in normal war is an appropriate thing. If you reread Herman Kahn, that escalates so fast you can't even begin to believe it. But part of that is that we have no, in the U.S., I can only talk about the U.S. now, we have no strategic understanding anymore. Nobody does strategic planning. Certainly corporations don't. The short term. And government people do not. I'll try to cut this very short. I had a lunch a couple of years ago with three very senior people, one of whom organized a major strategic thing in the Pentagon. And they agreed, if I gave you the names, you'd all know them. They all agreed that there was no strategic understanding, no strategic planning. And that means that anything that happens is a random shot. And that aggravated by a very ancient mechanism for imposing decisions is absolutely scary. Now, there are other things which are less impacted. We held a meeting about 3 years ago on dual-use technologies. There was nuclear, there was biological, which is really scary. A high school kid can do a huge amount of damage, and you can buy it all over the internet, no problem. And cyber, which I related one of the stories when I said, kinetic response. But again, it's nobody has done strategic understanding at U.S. government level. I can only talk about the U.S. And without that, it depends on the mood they're in. Especially in the U.S., where if the president pushes the button, guess what? There's no way of stopping it.
Yeah, I want to say two things, right? One thing is the technology is kind of improved and being advanced, and then there is a technology can be used in abuse and good use, right? Abuse and ethical use. So it's always new technology coming in, and then it's very difficult that we are expecting beforehand about how the new technology is going to be abused. So that's very difficult. But then we need to it's expect you can expect, we can prepare, we can so we have to do the same amount of effort, the kind of driving the technology to move forward. But being sitting at the kind of cybersecurity committee in the government this country, and then I wrote this picture. So can you show my computer 17, which might be not be agreed by many of you in this room, but I brought this because a lot of stakeholders to think about the resiliency, security, and safetyness of the technology. But now this is not the cybersecurity alone, right? This is a social thing, because we are talking about the cyber civilization. There, a lot of those are the example of three major stakeholders to think about security and the resiliency. But we don't have the exact kind of a system protocols, and then what is the law, what is the the common function, what is the kind of protocol when something happened, and what is the coordination they can provide. That type of thing is not properly created before, but I think we need to do this. So this is basically, as I said, I showed this to the many parts of the government, and then not necessarily be agreed, but this is my idea.
That looks good.
I'll make it short and sweet. Military training 101 is that everything is a threat. Everything is a risk. So in that sense, if I account for everything as a threat or everything as a risk, what I'm scared of the most is the invisible impact. The ability to affect our decisions, our behavior, the pervasive use of technology to drive us into doing certain things, like using technology in a dual use, like committing cyber crimes or regulating them. It's the invisible impact that information or misinformation has on us. And I think that in terms of being resilient, knives are dual-use technology. They cut cucumbers and they cut people. We need to be aware of that, and we need to develop the resilience to understand how are we impacted by the things that we see, by the things that we read, by the conversations that we have, and how do we distinguish for ourselves what is right and what is wrong, because what is ethics, what is morals? It's the human ability to decide right from wrong in different contexts, in different situations. This is the kind of agile ability that machines don't have. And this is the idea of the discussion. Recognizing that this is a risk and trying to be resilient against that, I think would help solve a lot of issues.
Yeah, just fast. Yeah, I agree if you can be resilient. I used to work in my youth on anti-missile systems, where you have a minute or two to make a decision on whether you are going to launch or not launch. It's very difficult to be resilient in that situation. You need a lot of strategic guidance. You need a lot of scenario planning. You have to be able to look at what all the options were and which path you're on, because the result of not having that is catastrophic. And you can see several cases in the past where that's saved probably the world. But how can the cyber world help that? It hasn't done that good to date, but it sort of has to.
I can invite one quick comment from the floor if, on this topic. And then I'm going to invite 30 seconds closing remark from each of you. You okay? Okay, then do you want to start?
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Great. So I think one of the challenges that we have ahead of us is really thinking about the complexity, about all the different parts of what it means to be a cyber civilization, be it human rights, be it digital economy, be it risks and negotiations. We really need to think about all of these things, and we are only 3 people, clearly 2 very distinguished people, but we could really use a lot of people to talk to and bounce ideas with, and really kind of help us, take us out of our comfort zone. So 30 seconds, what I want for you is your feedback, your pushback, your participation. Highly appreciated.
Thank you.
Yeah, as we have discussed, a lot of issues and a lot of unknown things happening. But I would like to be, kind of optimistic in terms, and also try to find out the kind of outcome for the proposal for the governance, proposal for the new technology, and then understanding, get the people to understand what this new civilization would be. Probably those are going to be activities of this CCRC.
Thank you.
Yeah. I always like to be optimistic. I think we can do something real in our future research that could help enormously. Talking to some of the people already in Japan, I can see directions. We've tried to pick an advisory board which can help us. They're a very strange set of people that cover an area we don't cover, which is good, and they're willing to give advice. On the other hand, all my experience says one should be optimistic but realistic. It's a big path to go, and the results can be either help or not help, and I'm getting a little confused, but it can help guide the future is the optimistic path. I hate to think about the negative side of that. I think we're at a critical inflection point. And I think it's necessary for people to start thinking about where we're going. And that's the subject we're aiming at.
Thank you very much. Instead of trying to come to any kind of conclusion to this last discussion, or even to summarize today's discussion, I want to pick on one word that Anik said, which was the amplifier. And
It's the new disruption.
yeah, and so we now have technology. Well, we now have a huge amplifier which can amplify the silliness or the wisdom peoples for spectacularly bad things can happen, but we would like spectacularly good things happen. And I guess we would like to really think hard about this. And I would like to invite all of you to participate in this. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, the audience, everybody. So this concludes the sober part.